Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Between Two Studs. I'm Alex Studd.
And I'm Ron Studd.
And Ron, for episode 51, tonight on the show, we got Mr. Josh Noel. How are you doing tonight, Josh?
I'm doing well. Nice to be with you, Studs. Thanks for having me.
Very excited to have you on. It's a little sneak peek. We're going to be talking a lot about beer, but before we do that, Josh knows this. We pay honor to both our guest, you, but also the sponsor of the show, the official spirit of Between Two Studs, Malort. And I understand, Josh, you're going to be joining us.
I am. I'm actually a big Malort fan.
That's awesome.
I love that. So it sounds like you and I are drinking the same thing. I got this bottle. I've had it actually. I've been waiting a while to drink it, and I just opened it up for you because you're a beer guy, and we're going to talk about it on the show. But this is the Anti-Hero Malort, which is also what you're drinking.
Correct. Yep. I've got regular Malort, but I also have this in reserve for special occasions, and I consider this a special occasion.
I love it. Ron's got the OG.
Right?
Cheers, gentlemen.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Wow.
Love it.
Okay, so this is the first time I've had this. I don't know if I like it more than regular Malort, but it is definitely different. There's definitely a little bit of you can tell there's some beer influence. But Josh, do you actually? I don't know. What's the story? What was the collaboration? Do you know?
I do. I actually wrote an article about it for the Chicago Tribune, and it's actually interesting. So when the pandemic hit, there was all this beer in kegs in the market because that's what life was before COVID, right? There were bars and there were restaurants, and breweries sold their beer to them in kegs. And literally, overnight, that vanished. So there was all this beer in kegs in the market that was going out of code. And that's something that would be especially acute with a hoppy beer, like Revolution Brewing here in Chicago, their Anti-Hero IPA, which is their flagship beer. So there was a problem. This was a huge problem there were a lot of problems when the pandemic hit. It's almost easy to forget that now. How we misuse the word literally all the time?
Yes. Figuratively?
Well, the industry was almost literally, but it really is almost literally turned upside down. Still not quite literally, but you get my point.
Sure.
Yeah.
But it was just, it's like we've never seen anything even remotely like it in the beer industry or in the restaurant industry or the hospitality industry in general. And one example of that is all this beer in the market suddenly going out of code because restaurants and bars just weren't a thing all of a sudden. So one creative solution to that for Revolution was to recall all these old kegs and take the kegs that were going out of code in their cooler and warehouse, and they decided to turn it into Malort. So they, and I wrote a whole article about this. So if you Google, Revolution Brewing and Malort and Chicago Tribune, you'll see the article. But that's what this is. It is IPA distilled into Malort, and then it's given the Malort treatment, which is aged on wormwood. And it definitely, I do prefer it to quote unquote regular.
You like it more than the OG?
I do. I think it has more depth. I think it's a more sort of complete shot.
Yeah. So do you
or
know
cocktail base, whatever you want.
To the best of your knowledge, are they going to continue doing this, or is this just a limited time release?
They did a second thing.
That might have been this.
Entirely sure what happened. That could be it. The one you're holding might be the second version of it. The original one just has the regular Malort label, but then it's got this. That's different. That's the Revolution logo, and then there's the Anti-Hero guy. So I think this was the first version. What you have, I think, is the second version, and I think they were going to keep doing some projects together, but I don't know that it's going to be a year-round staple. But but they're going to keep working together. Was my understanding last time I talked to them.
So cool. Well, Josh, throughout the episode, I will be sampling a little bit more of this, and by the end, maybe my opinion will change. I might say by the end, this is far superior than the OG. We'll find out together.
Why don't you like it better? Can we talk about that for a second? What do you think of it?
It's probably just coming from the fact that I have a very fixated flavor on what I'm expecting Malort to be, and obviously it's not. Let me just do right here, right on the line. Let me just give me a little.
I mean, while he's doing that, I mean that kind of reminded me of the barrel aged Malort. I like bourbon, and I really enjoyed the BAM. But I found I enjoyed the regular Malort better than BAM, just because I felt like BAM sort of tasted like it kind of tastes like the Malort that you give to a friend that hides it for 10 years and then pulls it out of the closet just to be like, oh hey, I've got your Malort here. It just kind of tasted like it got aged, but it didn't improve any. If that makes any sense.
The subtlety is a lot less for the barrel aged, in my opinion, than this. This is significantly different in flavor.
I'd imagine, especially with the IPA profile on that, right?
Yeah, I don't know, Josh. I don't know if I have a good answer for you other than it doesn't taste like Malort. It tastes like something else that has Malort in it. But let's put a pin in it. We will come back because I was saying this before Josh and I chatted this morning.
Mm-hmm.
And I said it took me about 4 or 5 shots of Malort before I was like, oh, I like the flavor. I enjoy it. This isn't a gag gift. This isn't like someone's in town. I wanna make them feel terrible for a moment. So maybe
to be fair, it is that.
Yeah,
but it's also
right. Fair.
Right.
So maybe it takes me 4 or 5 shots before I really like this. I don't know. We'll find out together.
It took me a few to sort of wrap my brain around it, but I just would come back to, I think it's just, again, it just sort of has more depth to it. And I like that about it.
Yeah, that's fair. All right. So, Josh, buckle up. We're going to get started with the show. We call this the Ember Round.
Welcome to the Between Two Studs Ember Round.
Wow, Ron, that was, you've really, we upped our budget, didn't we?
Just a little.
Yeah, I like that. Hey, so Josh, this is the part of the show where it's really just getting to know you a little bit, kind of setting up the rest of the podcast. So, first question, we have never actually met in person, but there's always a connection between Ron and I and our guest. What's the quick connection?
Oh, you're asking me.
That's
well, I only just learned the connection, which is your cousin is married to my friend's wife.
yes.
Right? Do I have that right?
I think so. Yeah, isn't that a great? And Andy Howard was a guest on our show earlier in the season, so I think he was episode 46. So for those listening, this is the connection. We got to know Josh, and excited to have you on the program.
And do you know how I know Andy? We met in a man's yoga class.
Oh, cool.
So cool.
Like 15 years ago, back when men doing yoga was still kind of novel.
Was it
Like now it's like any bro can do yoga. But let me tell you something, 15 years ago, to be a man doing yoga, that was kind of awesome. And so it was just these 6 dudes, and Andy was one of the dudes, and I was one of the dudes, and we did it in this woman's apartment. She was our teacher. She was wonderful. In Logan Square here in Chicago. And we would get together on like Saturday mornings at 9:00, and
Wow.
and she led us in yoga. And the yoga class only lasted a year, maybe a year and a half. But let me tell you that the dudes who do yoga together stay tight.
Do you still yoga?
No, I'll stretch now and then, but that's about it.
Yeah.
But I like yoga. I got a lot of respect for yoga.
Yeah. Well, very cool. All right. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself. What are some of your areas of interest?
Oh, man. My areas of interest, personally or professionally?
A little bit of both.
All the above.
Well, I guess professionally, I write about beer and the restaurant industry. So the beer industry, the restaurant industry for the Chicago Tribune.
Mm-hmm.
I've done that for, I've been a career journalist. So the only quote unquote real job I've ever had was in journalism. I've dabbled in, delivering pizzas and things like that, and enjoyed it very much. But journalism's always been my career. Newspapers in particular. I've been at the Chicago Tribune since 2005, which is a long time ago now. I've been a news writer covered a lot of crime and violence and those kinds of stories. And then I became the travel writer at the Chicago Tribune. That was pretty fun. I got to travel and write about it.
Very cool.
What could be bad, right? And then that somehow became travel and beer writer because the beer industry started becoming a thing. And, I started writing about it in 2009. Chicago was home to about maybe a dozen breweries at the time.
Wow.
And the food editor, Joe Gray, great guy, said, when I had just become travel writer, and food and travel were under the same sort of broad umbrella at the Tribune, and he said, hey, there's this beer thing sort of bubbling up in Chicago. There's like a dozen breweries now. Wow, holy cow. Do you mind keeping an eye on the beer industry when you're not traveling? And I thought, sure, that'd be great, because I had some interest and some knowledge of beer. So slowly, the beer writing became more and more of my job over the next decade, and travel became less and less because, newspapers have changed, and the Tribune had this really ambitious travel desk back when I was doing that with a really big budget, and now it has no travel desk with no budget. And that's sort of reflective of what's going on in newspapers. But fortunately for me, just, personally and journalistically, as sort of the newspaper travel model was winding down at the Tribune, the local beer scene was exploding. And so those dozen breweries are now like 250 breweries.
Incredible.
So there's been no shortage of stuff to write about. And then coincidentally, going into the year 2020, I said to that food editor, Joe, I said, writing about beer is cool, but I need to sort of expand a little bit and do some other things. And I'm really interested in writing about the restaurant industry as an industry, because it's it's a fascinating
This was
industry.
going into 2020.
Yeah, you get where I'm going with this. At the end of 2019, I said this is what I want to be doing in 2020, and then in March of 2020, we all know what happened, and I've been sort of our lead restaurant industry COVID writer for the last 2.5 years. So I've been doing, and the beer industry's taken it in the teeth, just like the restaurant industry. So at this point, I write about beer culturally, like here's some good beers to drink and why they're good, but also a lot of beer, sort of business writing. So beer industry writing, restaurant industry writing from the cultural perspective and the business perspective. And that's what I'm doing these days. And then beyond that, I'm very interested in politics and protecting democracy and making sure that whatever the hell has become of the Republican Party doesn't take this country down in a flaming wreck. And that's of great interest and importance to me. And also, I like baseball.
Yeah? Wait, so Cubs guy or Sox guy?
Yeah, no, I'm a Cubs guy. I grew up on the north side of Chicago.
Okay.
And I'm just that's kind of my religion. And honestly, I'm much less into it now as an adult than I was. But I grew up a Cubs fan. I grew up going to Cub games with my dad. And when you grow up that way, you're just anti-Sox. And, I don't actively wish the worst to Sox fans, but whenever the White Sox lose, I smile, is the truth of it. I take no pleasure in it. It's just how I grew up. So, go Cubs. That's all I have to say.
Awesome. Well, so speaking of the beer industry, what are you currently imbibing on right now?
Well, Malort with you.
Heck yeah.
Beer wise,
Yeah.
I went through a big 10-year phase of loving IPA. Probably like a lot of beer drinkers. And hazy IPA became a thing a few years ago, and that sort of lost the thread for me. I'm really not into the hazy IPAs, and that sort of helped steer me back toward kind of like the original soul of what beer was, or at least in modern times. And that's just, lager. I love Pilsner now.
Yes.
I love Helles Lager. I drink my beer fridge is now. I have a few IPAs. I still love a good IPA. Sure. I love oatmeal stout. I love Kolsch, but most of what I drink these days is lager.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get onto it as we get further along. But Ron and I have a very similar sentiment. I think there was that couple years where, if you made an IPA, I wanted it, and then at a certain point, it's double and the triple, and it's just how much hops can you get slapped with, and I lost that level of interest, and I kind of refound my love. And Ron and I, we originally grew up very close to Canada, so I have a very special place in my heart for a good Pilsner, and I think the Canadians do that very well.
Which state did you grow up in?
New York.
Canada?
We were very close, just south of Buffalo.
Got it.
Yeah.
Go Bills.
Go Bills.
You Bills fans?
Die hard
Heck
Bills
yeah.
fans.
Oh. Yeah, that's a team that I feel like no one can hate, right? Like, no one dislikes.
We lost four
So-
Super Bowls in a row. Can you really hate the Bills? Come on.
Yeah, no, I always root for you guys. I'm a Bears fan. I'm a Chicago guy. But, I'd be happy if the Bills win the Super Bowl this year. So I'm
All
rooting
right,
It would be amazing.
Josh said it first.
Thank you.
Josh said it there. So, Ron,
Good luck.
what are you working on right now? Because I see you're drinking a beer.
All right, so because we've got Josh on, I had to. I've got a few beers here, and I'm going to go through the two that I've had so far.
All right,
And
and
then-
then you're going to let us know what you're going to have throughout the rest of the episode.
Sure, I'm not going to drink
right.
that many, and we don't advocate crazy drinking, but I'm just going to put it out there.
If you're home and you're not leaving your home, I think it's okay to have
Why
a
not?
couple.
Because normally we're drinking bourbon, but tonight I'm drinking beer. So, all right. So starting off is 420 IPA. This is from Sweetwater. This is a Georgia, Atlanta-based brewery, right?
Huh?
And it
So
is an
I've
IPA.
I've had the Sweetwater 420, but I've never heard of
The G13.
that. Yeah, I never heard of that.
So the big thing with a G13 is when you open it, it smells like you just walked into a Dead and Company concert. Like, it's got a
Perfect.
big... Yeah, it's definitely got the hemp vibes to it. It just reeks of dank. Which, it's a very good... I like the Mango Kush, and I think I talked about that at one point on one of our episodes. But the next one I've moved on to, this is what I'm drinking right now. This is Victory Golden Monkey. So Victory, they're right around Philadelphia,
Downingtown, Pennsylvania.
right? It's classic. I love it. The big thing I don't like about it is you can't drink too many of these. Like, they add up very quickly because of the 9.3% alcohol by volume. And then my next one is going to be another Georgia classic. This is Creature Comforts Tropicalia. And Tropicalia, the cool part about this is that a lot of the Marvel movies, they're all shot in Georgia, and the cast of a lot of the actors, they actually were asked originally at one point, what kind of beer do you guys want to have on set? And a lot of the cast were like, hey, we really like Creature Comforts Tropicalia. It's a very light beer, perfect for the summer. And there for a little bit of time, because of all of the Marvel films that were going on around here, it was actually a little tough to find, but thankfully, all good, easy to find now. So it's a very good summer drinkable beer. What about you, Alex? What are you drinking?
So I brought two for the show.
Cool.
First one is the Old Irving Brewing having their Kolsch. Never had this before, and honestly, I was just enamored by the can. The actual.
Tell us about that.
Well, okay, the quick story, and then it sounds like Josh knows a lot about this beer, so I'd love you to give a quick talk about it if you'd like. But Josh, our great-grandfather, his name's Irving Studd, and he lied when he was 15 years old, said he was 18. This is back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and worked his way up, starting by shoveling wood in the furnace for what ultimately became the New York Central. By the time he retired, he was a locomotive engineer. So I saw Irving, his name, and I saw the locomotive, and I said, this is my great-grandfather speaking to me. Obviously, it's just older. Irving is a neighborhood in Chicago, but I had to get it. Josh, you were mentioning this year, you said it, to the best of your knowledge, you actually won an award, correct?
Yes, that beer won. Excuse me, that won one of the three places. I want to say the Great American Beer Festival this year in that category. So that's actually you picked wisely.
Wow.
I'm going to just
our great grandfather would be happy.
A laid back kind of podcast. I'm going to look this up in real time.
Yeah, I was going to say I lucked out. The other beer that I'm having tonight, while you look that up, just so you know, is I'm having Off Color Brewing Tooth and Claw, which I have never had. Another beer that I just picked, and this is a dry hopped lager.
Nice.
I think that also.
Wow.
Oh wait, no, that's a different one up there. No, different Off Color beer. But no, that's a wonderful beer. Yeah, Off Color is a wonderful brewery. Here we go.
I love it. We got the live research coming in.
Well, we're zeroing in. Here it is. Della won a silver medal in 2021 in the Kolsch category. Yeah, so that you are drinking the second best Kolsch in the nation.
It tastes pretty damn good. So, all right. Nope.
And here, wow, and this is even more impressive. You know how this is second best? If you know how many entries? 187. Wow. So that's a serious award right there. So yeah, that's Old Irving makes some good beer. Chicago is blessed with a lot of really wonderful breweries. Not all of them super trendy, but Old Irving's one of those kind of like if you know, you know kind of thing. There's a good one down in Atlanta.
I haven't tried them yet.
Have you had them? Highly recommended. They're the brewer / owner's stepdad actually used to work at the Tribune, which is how I know of them. But the stepdad went down there to visit, and he actually muled some of their beer back for me to try. And I was quite impressed with a couple of them.
I'll have to check them out. I know, like it's interesting. I was living in Delaware, right? And certainly got a lot of the good Philadelphia beers, some good Delaware beers like Dogfish Head. And then when I moved down here, it was like, okay, hey, we've got New Relic, we've got Sweetwater, there's a lot of cool breweries down here in Atlanta, and that's something where it's been kind of fun just trying that out, figuring out what I like and what I don't like too. So,
Ron, as long as you know in the pecking order, it's not as good as Chicago. As long as you know that.
I mean, I need to try more Chicago beers to confirm, but I'm glad to work my way into that to confirm.
As you should, but so the nation is now home to nearly 10,000 breweries. Back in the late 70s, it was under 100. As recently as, I'm sort of ballparking here, but in about 2008, it was about 1,200. Right, so now we're up to about 10,000. So there's this explosion has happened. It's happened everywhere in all 50 states. And one of the really fun parts of it is that let's not over romanticize it. There's a lot of subpar beer out there, but there's also a lot of really good beer out there, and you just sort of never know where you're going to turn it up. And that's one of the really fun things about what's happened to the American beer industry.
And we're going to dive more into that for sure. Josh, we got to ask this question. It's a favorite. We ask every guest this question, and I know you did not look at these questions ahead of time. So this is gonna come at you without any preparation, which is all the more impressive. So we ask all of our guests.
Okay, 37.
That's right. You got it. No, so the question is, we ask every single one of our guests this. We say, pick a piece of art, and art can mean anything. It could be a song, a movie, a book, a painting, anything that speaks to you, that represents you, something that you think about, reflect on, and tell us what it is and why it's important.
I'll go with this right here.
What are we looking at?
Ooh.
So this says, to Dad, and then that says Evan, that's my son's name, and then this is, I don't know if that's me or what that is. But my 7-year-old is in a very artistic phase where he's constantly just drawing stuff and giving it to me, and sometimes it'll say, I love you. Sometimes it'll just say, like, here's one that says, Dad's love.
Very cute.
Evan love.
Oh, cool.
And it's sort of beautiful to see your kid expressing him or herself and seeing himself and you and reflecting it in their art. And the stuff thing I just showed you is probably a little old now, but now he's drawing like penguins and dinosaurs and stuff. And but my favorite stuff is the art that sort of reflects how he sees not just the world, but his sort of his family, me and his mom, and him and his sister in his art. And to the point that we put this stainless steel board up on the kitchen wall, and so we could just sort of stick all that stuff up there because it was sort of too much. Like, I didn't just want to stick it on the fridge and pile one on top of each other, but we sort of arrange them and present them to the household so we can really sort of take them in and appreciate them and reflect on them.
That's cool.
So
you know, it's interesting, and I'm gonna make an observation as the only one who's not a father here, and I'm curious your take on it. I find it interesting that at least most young children I know, and I think I fell into this category. Somehow, when you're really young, I remember telling my dad and my mom how much I love them all the time. In the same way, Evan, made all these marks, and then you go through this era in your teenager years and probably even some of your 20s where I feel like you just never, like, it's like, no, I'm not going to. And then all of a sudden it goes to the other way again, where I know every time I talk on the phone to my dad now, I will always say, I love you, Dad. And I find that to be very fascinating, the evolution of life, where it's like you love, and then it's like, well, I'm not going to talk about that. We knew we loved each other. There was never animosity. But it was like I didn't say that word. I guess I wasn't. I didn't think it was cool or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is the evolution of life. It's maturing, and it is, and sadly, maybe or maybe not. I think it's probably a healthy thing to sort of step away from that. To go through that rebellious phase. And honestly, Evan's already, he's 7 and he's already wading into it a little bit. So he can be very loving, 1 minute and then be giving me absolute hell the next. But it's just part of the human experience, But he's still young enough where it's just really wonderful to see.
Yeah, I think. I think
you go ahead,
when it comes to love, it's such a. I don't know. Maybe this is like one of those gender things too, where I think for males, there's there's a certain point where in your life, love is very much kind of out there as a, yes, I enjoy, I like it. And then it's like, you kind of hit those years where it's like, oh, well, I love her. She's my girlfriend. And it's kind of like you redefine what love can be. And I almost wonder if maybe there's some level of that where you're like, well, yeah, I love my parents, but, like, I love her. And I wonder if maybe some of that falls into it, because then you kind of fall into, well, I love her and I also love my parents and I love my family, but it's still, I don't know. I feel like as a guy, there is there's different levels of love, if you will. And maybe some of that adolescence is kind of coming into understanding and maybe feeling like, how do you appropriately convey that feeling? Right. And it's kind of a weird, like, I think love gets tossed around a lot. Like, oh yeah, you love this, you love that, you love this. But especially when there's like familial type of relations, it's kind of like, well, I love my parents, but you don't necessarily feel comfortable maybe saying it all the time, especially when you're in your teens and your early 20s.
Although as a 6-year-old, you have no problem saying. I just
Yeah.
think that's interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And maybe it means more as the adult. I don't know. I don't have kids. Maybe it means more when all of a sudden you wake up and you're in your late 20s and you start saying it again for the first time in 15 years, and maybe you have a better understanding and appreciation for what that word means. I don't know. I guess we'll have to wait a couple, 2 decades, and we'll ask you both about how your kids are treating you in 20 years.
Sounds good. Season, what would it be? Season 22 or something?
Season 22. We'll see how that is.
Ooh, that sounds... I'll
be back.
Awesome. All right. So our last and final question of the Ember Round. Josh, name one way that COVID has permanently impacted your life. So, ideally we look for the positives. But like for Alex and I, the thing that we always mention is this podcast actually started because of the pandemic. So what would that be for you, sir?
Well, this probably is this is also rooted in my family somewhat, but I'm sort of, I don't want to say done, but I spent so much time.
Sorry. Restart.
Ignore that. Keep going.
Is that getting edited out?
It'll be edited out.
Back?
Go ahead. You started
Yeah.
saying about growing up, your family.
Sure.
The pandemic, hit at a unique time for us all personally, right? That time for me was a time where I was sort of transitioning from spending a lot of time in bars and going to a lot of concerts toward spending more time with my family, with my kids, with my wife. My son was 5 when the pandemic hit. My daughter was 2. So I was kind of moving away. And I'd spent so much time standing in bars before the pandemic that when the pandemic hit, I didn't miss going out really at all. I'd been to so many concerts because I love music. I love live music. I'd been to so many concerts before the pandemic that when the pandemic hit, I just sort of didn't miss them. I just sort of felt like I could be done and that was okay. And I haven't had a beer inside a bar, I don't think, since the pandemic hit, and I'm not sure when I will again. I still love going to tap rooms and to bars, but it's just going to be on patios and outside from now on, and really not that often. So the pandemic, I think, just sort of accelerated something that was already happening for me personally, which was just sort of a shift away from that. I got married a little later. I didn't get married at 28. I got married in my early 40s. So I'd spent all my 20s and all my 30s in bars and at shows. And so I was just kind of ready to move on anyway. But the pandemic really sort of made me move on, and I've basically moved on, and I'm okay with it. I don't really miss it. I mean, I still, love my friends and seeing them and meeting them for a beer on a patio in summer, but just sort of that draw toward being out on a Friday in November, January, February in Chicago when it's just cold and I still feel it. I'm glad to be home. I'm glad to be drinking my Malort at home.
Love it. So this more or less this was already slowly happening, but COVID really ripped the Band-Aid off for you. In other words, yeah.
Basically, yeah. And I don't think I'll ever quite go back to my old relationship with those things. But it's also, my personal circumstances are driving that. But yeah, COVID sort of hit the accelerator on it, and I'm okay with it.
That's cool.
I'm very COVID cautious. I don't, the people who are walking around without masks in grocery stores and at Costco, I'm not judging those people. I'm just saying I don't get it because I wear a mask. I don't fucking want COVID.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that complicated.
Yeah.
I'm not scared of it. I just don't want it. I don't want it in my household. So, and it's still a thing. So I'm not acting like it's not a thing.
In terms of cases,
where
it's
I'm
more of a
at,
thing now than ever. So, or I don't know. If
Oh,
that's
for
true.
sure.
It seems like it is.
It's always been. It's like it's ebbed and flowed, and that's just the way it is. It's just the reality we're living in, and
Yeah,
it's
for sure.
just is
Hey,
what it
so
is.
Josh,
I don't want to lose my taste and smell. It'd be hard to
Absolutely.
Josh, I will say this on a lighter note: you just completed the Ember round. That's that applause.
Oh, great! Back at you.
All right. Hey, so Josh, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go to break. We come back. We're going to dive into a little bit of journalism, and then we're gonna. I know we've already talked about some beer, but there's a lot more to cover. So when we come back, we're going to talk to Josh about his journalism career and as well as more about beer. We'll be right back.
Hey, I know what you're thinking. Right now might be a good time to go and get a quick break, but here's the thing. I'm thinking that you could also use this as a good opportunity to like, subscribe, and drop a comment on this video. It would help us. It would also get the search algorithms to make sure that this video pops up for more people. So we'd really appreciate it. Hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. Thank you so much. Bye.
And welcome back to Between Two Studs. We are hanging out with Josh Noel, and I wanted to get into the topic of journalism. Obviously, you already mentioned, Josh, that you work for the Chicago Tribune, and to be honest, I consider real honest journalists to be an endangered species. I don't mean to sound negative, but can you quickly talk about what happened to the news industry from your perspective over the last 15, 20 years?
So it'd take me about 2 hours to fully answer that question. So let me go back real quick, which is real journalists are not an endangered species. Journalism is as vibrant as ever.
I love to hear that.
It is as in demand as ever. Just think about what it is. It is gathering facts and telling stories, right? And sometimes those are deeper, longer stories. Those are, they can be books, they can be magazine articles, they can be long newspaper articles, they can be short newspaper articles, they can be a tweet, right? That stuff has existed for generations upon generations upon generations, going back thousands of years, and it still exists, and it will continue to go on.
Well, so Josh,
and
maybe
do it reputably, is what journalism is, and that is, it is as vibrant as ever, and it is as necessary as ever because there's so much misinformation out there.
Yeah.
Especially with a political axe to grind. I think it can be harder to discern the real journalism from the propaganda. But it is there, and it is robust, and there are so many incredible journalists working today, and the information's out there. It's just sometimes it takes a little more critical thinking to, wade through that versus the absolute inanity of someone like whoever the, babbling talking head on Fox News is this week.
Well, yeah. So, Josh, maybe let me give a little bit more context to what I mean. I grew up watching the 6:30 evening news every night with Dan Rather. Right, that's how I grew up from very early on. We had dinner as a family at 6 o'clock, and we watched CBS evening news. And I remember an interview with Dan Rather after he retired, or I'm using those words loosely. That's a whole other conversation. But we talked about what journalism was. I mean, what made him was he was there in 1963 on November 22nd, right? He was there for the Kennedy assassination. And what he talked about was when you look at journalism throughout the 60s and 70s, and of course, long before that in the United States, there was this idea by CBS, by ABC, by NBC, that you had a civic duty, right, a social responsibility by the media to have objective journalism. And one of the things he talked about in the interview was that in the late 80s, early 90s, all of a sudden, GE bought NBC. CBS got bought by Viacom. And it devolved into how do we maximize every 30-minute slot? Let's reduce costs and maximize profit. And so, I, in my opinion, and again, I don't have a journalistic background, but I think it just naturally devolved into, well, why would I want to spend money on a journalist spending 6 months trying to dig into a story where nothing comes out of it? That could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Instead, I can just have 4 guys talking heads just spew out commentary. We'll call it news and we'll call it a day. And I guess that's kind of what I'm getting to, is this idea of you might spend 6 months on a project and come to nothing. It doesn't seem like a lot of organizations have that level of budget to be able to do that. At least from my opinion.
Yeah, again, I could take 2 hours to respond to this too. So the first thing I would say is I think I've never been the biggest fan of TV news.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been some incredible TV news coverage over the years. I imagine there still is. I personally get almost zero of my news through the television. I get it through the radio, through NPR. I get it through podcasts, and I get it through newspapers and magazines. I think I've cut cable news out completely. I don't watch. I mean, Fox News is absolute trash. There's just nothing else to say. It's just garbage. CNN, I think, is just exhausting, and I just gave up on that a long time ago. MSNBC, I don't watch any of it. I just don't. So I wouldn't use TV news as the example. Personally, I read the New York Times, daily. The Washington Post, and again, in NPR, those are sort of my go-tos. And I think there's a lot of really fantastic reporting still happening. I mean, no business wants to spend 6 months on something and have nothing come of it, right? I mean, that's not a good use of anyone's time. But at the biggest outlets, yeah, that's going to happen sometimes, and we don't know about those stories because those aren't published. But that is still happening, and the sort of well-run, responsibly run large organizations like that undoubtedly have that still happening. But the stuff they're producing is also it's crucial, especially at this moment in time. I do think, you used an interesting word that I grew up on in the industry, which is objective. But we've sort of moved on from that word. I think fairness has sort of replaced the word objective. I don't think objective even really means anything anymore. But fairness is paramount. Fairness and accuracy are absolutely paramount in journalism. They, on I was going to say always have been, but they haven't always have been. But in the modern era, certainly during my career, that has been a bedrock. You aspire for, and not just aspire, you work hard for fairness and for accuracy. And sometimes mistakes slip through. It happens, but a reputable outlet corrects its mistakes and takes responsibility for them. We've seen the New York Times screw up. We've seen the Washington Post screw up. We've seen the Chicago Tribune screw up. No one delights in that. But the journalists that work at those outlets, including the Tribune, we still have some outstanding journalists. That the paper has changed dramatically since I've been there. We had outlets, bureaus all over the world, all over the country, and all those global bureaus are gone. All those national bureaus are gone. We had an incredible array of columnists. All those columnists are gone. The Tribune has shrunk dramatically. It's been through several owners. There's been some questionable decisions in leadership over the years. The priority hasn't always been the journalism. Sometimes it's been the shareholders, and that I think there's a conversation to be had about whether that conflicts with the overall mission of the outlet. But those are broader questions. But there has been impact as a result of that, and now we're owned by a hedge fund. And Google Alden Global Capital, and you'll see a whole lot of coverage about them wading into the news industry and what that has meant for the news industry. And now the Chicago Tribune is owned by them.
So and
the Chicago Tribune's a lot smaller than as compared when Alden Global Capital took over. But they haven't fired anyone, but they also haven't been able to. Well, we're a union shop negotiating a contract. So the unionized employees, such as myself, we're not able. They could try to fire us, but they'd have a hell of a mess on their hand because you don't really have a free hand to just fire people while you're negotiating a labor contract. But there are non-union employees, and I don't believe they've fired anyone from there either. But really the point is that when they showed up, they offered buyouts, and a whole bunch of people just ran screaming toward the door. They didn't want anything to do with it. So even indirectly, the Tribune is a radically different place as compared to when they took over, and it's about a year ago at this point.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, I use the word objective, and I agree. I mean, I know for me, and maybe, Josh, you have a recommendation for me, but I know what I do is I subscribe. I have my national newspapers, and then I have my local. And nationally, I subscribe digitally to both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And I try to read the exact same article for each. And it's like, okay, I got my center-left interpretation, and I got my center-right interpretation. And now the onus is on me to figure out what is reality. And I respect both of those publications a lot. I'm just saying I know reading it there is a bias, and I have to do my best as an intelligent reader to read through those biases to make my own educated decisions.
Well, bias is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, there's plenty of people on the left who scream about the New York Times tilting right, if anything. I mean, you could argue that the New York Times threw the 2016 election to Trump by taking the Hillary Clinton email stuff so incredibly seriously, especially in the final days of the race. I mean, there's this famous front page where there's something, the headline's like, Clinton emails jolt campaign in final days. And there's this picture of Hillary on a plane with her advisor. And then the real thing that was galling to me is on the left side of the page. I've seen this so many damn times on Twitter that I have it almost committed to memory at this point. There's something about like some sanctimonious quote from Trump, of all people, like talking about what a game changer this latest revelation is. And the New York Times played it with a total straight face. I mean, that is not a center-left interpretation. If anything, they horribly, horribly dropped the ball on that story. And I'm not sure that didn't help tilt things toward Trump in the end. So I even take exception to the idea that the New York Times is center left. And
That's interesting.
Even I think the Journal is staffed with probably a lot of people who tilt more left. Their editorial page is undoubtedly slants right. That's inarguable. But I think the news coverage at both places, I think they just try to get it fair and accurate. I don't think they either play. I mean, I have friends at the Wall Street Journal, and let me tell you, their personal politics do not slant right. But really, the ultimate point is that reputable journalists, and the Times has them, the Journal has them, the Post has them, and the Tribune has them. They're still populating the industry, which is great news. They try to get it right, and they try to be fair in their reporting.
For sure. Well, and I think that leads into a really kind of interesting kind of segue, which is, so certainly we have a lot of national journalism that is skewing in different ways. Unfortunately, I think one of the problems that we get is that there's almost a homogenization that's occurring with the Associated Press. But one of the important things that's out there is the importance of local, right? Where local journalism is significantly important. I know for me, one of the things that I personally did was I actually subscribed to my local newspaper right when the pandemic started, because I wanted to actually support local journalism that actually was talking about the importance of what's going on in the community so that I could better understand it. Because I think that one of the problems that we get is that so much of the news is Associated Press driven. Here's the copy paste that just gets slapped to you. And I want to hear those local stories about what's going on. How do I respond? What's good? What's bad? Right? So when it comes to local newspapers versus the big newspapers that are much more regional or national in some ways, is what's the hope for them? Is there any hope at all? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I know. Excuse me. So I've worked at a very small newspaper. I've worked at a medium-sized paper, and now I've worked at the Chicago Tribune. So I've had all those experiences, and I'm no expert on what has happened to small newspapers, but from what I understand of it, what I've read about it, it's an absolute crisis, and that is where so much happens. I mean, really, yeah, we're talking about the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post, but it's that's the global look at what's happening. This where the sausage is really made is on the local level.
Couldn't say it any better, Josh. I mean, and we've had a lot of guests on our show where we talk about the importance of local politics. And I know you mentioned the importance of politics. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I got excited hearing you because I think Americans, we get excited talking about presidential elections. And it's like, yeah, at the end of the day, what's really going to affect you on a day-to-day basis has a lot to do with what's going on in your community. And if we don't have local journalists covering local media, how do you know what's going on local politics?
Yeah, and we've got, there's a lot fewer newspapers than there used to be. It's not it was a really good business model for a long time. There were a lot of really successful small local newspapers, and they were places where really good reporters got their start. And the whole industry has taken it in the teeth in a lot of ways. And yeah, it's the model has. I mean, honestly, the newspapers are still trying to figure out how to navigate it, how to monetize the internet. Like, it's, the Wall Street Journal probably did the smartest thing by charging from day one.
Right? Yeah. Well, and Josh, it's really interesting because I wanted to get your thoughts on this because from my perspective, and I'm 31, right? I know my generation, we grew up with the internet, the idea that information, and I'm going to use quotes here, should be free. Information should be free. And I think that was sort of the perception for a long time. But I can only speak from.
But information gatherers need to get
exactly.
paid. You know, I mean, it's like
exactly. But I will say, and I'm going to ask you this question because I have just my anecdotal, my immediate friends, and I'm curious if you're seeing it. What I want to say, my anecdotal immediate friends is, I'm noticing a lot of people, my group, meaning late 20s, early 30s, who we've gotten so tired of BuzzFeed bullshit articles that are free. And we're finally saying, you know what? I'm willing to pay. I know this is crazy. I'm willing to pay for good journalism. And I know I and most of my immediate friends who all fall into that late 20s, early 30s crowd, at least my group, we're starting to do that. It's like, all right, yeah, I thought news was free, but that news is shit. I will pay for good journalism. And I guess my question to you is, are you, is the Tribune, are you seeing that trend where all of a sudden these people, and I consider myself one of them, a freeloader, historically are now saying, you know what? Yeah, I'm tired of BuzzFeed articles. I want real journalism.
Well, I certainly can't speak for the Tribune, but I can tell you that we call them conversions, people who are converted to subscribers based on our stories. Mm-hmm. That's the name of the game right now. That's, you know, how many conversions did that story generate? That's where the action is. So yes, we're hyper focused on it. But it's incumbent on the outlets to provide the product that people find value in, right? So you can't keep cutting your outlet and crying poor. Well, the industry is in such shambles. We're going to have to keep getting smaller and smaller. Because guess what? People aren't going to find value in that, and they're not going to want to subscribe. Mm-hmm. So it's, I think it's incumbent on each news outlet to make itself valuable. And I have a lot of respect, for instance, for what Block Club Chicago has done. They're small and they're scrappy and they've got a good brand and they've got a good nose for news and they're out there beating the streets. They're sort of like the new alternative weekly, just sort of their model. I mean, the Reader, the great Chicago weekly newspaper, Alternative Weekly, they've fallen on hard times too. I mean, they had an entire section that was all lawn ads, and those are all online now. So they lost all that revenue, and they're trying to figure out how to survive. And Block Club is just an example of finding, they've found a way to make themselves relevant in a different way, and they're not dependent on their I mean, so far as I know, on their advertising, so their classifieds. They're just out there creating value in what they do, and they've got a very fervent fan base. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's I think the name of the game. And the New York Times has done it. I mean, it can at one end you got the New York Times doing it. They're doing podcasts. They're doing advice columns. They bought Wordle, for God's sake.
Well, and don't forget
and
the
they've
Athletic.
got.
I've been very impressed with New York Times as a business. I'm very impressed with how they're managing.
Exactly. Yeah, they as a business, they have made journalism a thriving business under their roof. They provide value. That's the example on one side. Block Club is the example on the other. They provide value to their readers on another. And that's the name of the game now. And it's good to hear what you're saying about your crew of people deciding that they want to find value in something and to support it. But then it's incumbent on each outlet to provide that value to get that business.
Well,
so it's a very tricky time right now.
Well, and again, that is just my
industry.
Anecdotal experience. But I'll say again, I think there's people who are saying, "Yeah, I'm tired of clickbait. I want real news." And wait, I guess I can actually get real news if I'm willing to pay for it. I guess I'm not even being fun. Like, I'm being half funny. Josh, like, in my generation, we never paid for. I've never paid in my life, Josh. I'm 31. I've never paid for a physical newspaper in my entire life, ever.
Well, you know what? Can you just humor me and go drop the $1? I don't even know what the hell the Chicago Tribune costs anymore. Just buy the paper copy of the Tribune. Actually, not tomorrow. Wait till Sunday. Buy the Sunday paper.
It's got discounts in it.
And sit
Trust me.
there and read it. Yeah, clip a couple ads. You'll make your money back, or a couple coupons, and just sit there and hold the newspaper.
Yeah.
Just see what that's like. You'll get a little news ink on your fingers. You might have to wash your hands after. It's it worked for our grandparents. So just wade in. Just give it a shot.
I'll do that for you, Josh.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I do subscribe, by the way, and I'm not lying. I do subscribe digitally to the Chicago Tribune because I find that I need a national news, and then I got to find out what's going on with Lori Lightfoot. I always got to keep an eye on her. You never know. She has the biggest dick in Chicago. I got to know what else is going on in her world. So,
yeah, we got some, and with Chicago Tribune still, don't count us out. We have a lot of talented reporters, and we got a couple scrappy scrappers over there at City Hall. So
yeah, and Ron, I know Ron doesn't know Chicago, but we got a lot of characters in Chicago. We got to keep an eye on these folks. So yes, I am a Chicago Tribune subscriber. So
we got characters, we got pizza, we got hot dogs, and we got the Bears.
The Bears.
That's it.
No.
That's really it.
I know, like, for me, one of the cool things that I found out this past year, just as a quick side note, so the city Alex and I grew up in actually has a local newspaper that I was able to get delivered to my house in Georgia. So we grew up in Western New York. I actually got that delivered.
Cool.
And I love getting the local Forsyth County newspaper in Georgia.
What's it called? The Forsyth County Observer?
Forsyth County News. So I subscribe to them.
I think the Observer sounds
Yeah.
cool.
Hey, you know what? Write a letter to the editor and ask him to change the title.
I mean, maybe.
Bet they'd print it.
I did write some letters, actually, to some of the people who wrote the opinion columns, which was kind of cool. Because I think those guys, I mean, I don't know about you, Josh, but every once in a while, I think it's helpful to have, like, some readers kind of just to write in to be like, hey, I like what you're doing, or, hey, what about this, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's a little bit of that
For
community
sure.
feedback, which is important, especially for small communities.
It's cool to hear from readers, unless the reader's a total dipshit, in which case it's not cool at all.
Which I try not to be a dipshit, but you never know.
Well, no, I'm not. I'm sure you're not, but trust me, there's some dipshit readers.
Oh, I
out
bet.
there.
I bet.
Also, some real racist pieces of trash.
I bet.
I mean, God, the stuff you hear from
Yeah.
people. Ooh.
So shifting gears a little bit, let's get back into beer because I love beer. I've got some beer
yes.
here.
You never go
right. So Alex and I, one of our favorite documentaries is the movie Beer Wars. Have you ever seen that or familiar with that?
I've heard of it. I don't think I've ever seen it.
Well,
actually.
so Josh, honestly, as people who we are not experts in the beer industry, that was my introduction to really. I mean, first of all, that history that you talked about, right? How many breweries existed in 1970, 2008, 2022, but also just how difficult it is with the laws on the books as it relates to distribution of beer. And how difficult it is for a small brewery to really compete with just getting on the shelves. That was eye opening, and I will do a call out. If you get a chance, I'm sure you can stream it somewhere. Beer Wars. It's a really interesting and fascinating documentary, and they have interviews from Sam Calgione of Dogfish Head and Jim Cook of Sam Adams. They're all on it. And it's just interesting hearing their perspective. And while they're filming the documentary, all of a sudden that's when Coors and Miller merge and Budweiser gets bought by InBev. And it's like, how are you supposed to compete with these juggernauts? And that's kind of what the documentary's about.
Yeah, I should watch that. I mean, I wrote a book sort of about that. Barrel-aged stout and selling out. Goose Island, Anheuser-Busch, and how craft beer became big business. I mean, the answer is it's really rooted in sort of the what craft beer has done and the ability for craft brewers to sell directly to consumers. And a lot of laws have changed as a result of, the 100 breweries turning into 10,000 breweries. And the biggest has been craft beer's ability to sell directly to consumers and have tap rooms and sell, pour a beer, push it across the bar and say, here's your fresh IPA, $7, please. And they make a lot of profit from that. But also their ability to sell, 6-packs or 4-packs to go. And to do big beer releases, like Revolution, who we talked about before, releases barrel-aged beers, a few times a year. These big, 15% or so boozy stouts and barley wines aged in whiskey barrels. And they sell those direct to the consumers. And they make a lot of money that way. And by being able to do that, that's how they're able to compete with big beer, basically. I mean, in as much as they can. They're not even really competing. I mean, they're playing different games, but it allows them to sort of forge a viable business model.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the complications that was mentioned in that documentary specifically is that the small guys, they're trying just to do their best to get their name out there. And one of the problems has been that a lot of the bigger breweries, they're kind of creating these fake microbreweries where it's like, oh yeah, this is, Captain Ron's small distillery, but I'm really owned by InBev, or I'm really owned by this other big company.
Well, and Ron, I don't even know up until and they may have changed in the last 5 years, but I remember about 5 years ago I looked at a Blue Moon can and it said made by Blue Moon Brewery, and I thought that was so unethical. Right, I didn't see anything on there which showed this is a giant conglomerate. Like it wasn't even on the can. You wouldn't know as a consumer.
Right.
That's kind of been that's really what my book was about, is sort of everything you're talking about.
Which, by the way, before you go on, we will provide a link to that book in the introduction or the info for this episode. So please be sure to click that, check it out yourself. And back to you, Josh. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, for sure. I mean, I think that's... You can't blame the big beer companies for wanting to dabble in the craft beer world. I mean, especially from, 2015 to sort of up until the pandemic, maybe a little bit before that when craft beer started to cool. Craft beer was hot. So you couldn't blame the big beer companies for wanting to be involved. And you could also give Molson Coors, formerly Miller Coors, a lot of credit for creating Blue Moon, because that, I think, is still the biggest selling craft beer in the U.S., and it was a huge gateway beer for a lot of people. But I do think that you hit on the one criticism that I think is very fair, which is a lack of transparency around that. I've written a lot about it. I've talked a lot about it on Twitter. Anheuser-Busch is now the largest manufacturer of craft beer in the United States. They made, as detailed in the book, before buying Goose Island in Chicago here in 2011, Anheuser-Busch basically made no what I would call credible craft beer. They made Shock Tower. They tried to make some craft beers under the Michelob banner, but nothing that ever really took off or people really took seriously. And that's why they had to buy Goose Island, and then they kept on buying. And I don't even know how many
everybody.
Breweries
and that's the thing. It's like
about 18
the
or
onus.
So. But you'd never. But they go to great lengths to sort of obscure the fact that they own these
The onus is on the
brands, and even more
consumer
than that.
to know and research.
The onus is on the consumer. And the consumer, and some consumers just don't care, which is fine. But a lot of consumers, I think, think they're buying X when in fact they're buying Y. And there's also this sleight of hand where Anheuser-Busch is. Some Goose Island beers are made by Anheuser-Busch. They're Anheuser-Busch beers with a Goose Island label on them. And other Goose Island beers are actually made by Goose Island in Chicago. And those beers will sit side by side on store shelves, and the consumer, there's like 0.5% of consumers that are able to tell the difference. And it is there in the very fine print if you know what to look for. And again, let me go back. Some consumers just don't care. But most, the vast majority of consumers aren't even equipped to be able to tell which is which, and Anheuser-Busch depends on.
Yep. Taking advantage of people's ignorance is, and let me
basically, I think that's a fair.
And let me be the first to say, Josh, in my early 20s, I was a very pretentious beer drinker. What I mean by that is I would say, "Oh, light beers, it's garbage. I hate it." Right? The whole joke. What's the difference between having sex, in a canoe, right? Fucking close to water, that whole thing. And then, as I've gotten older, I will say this: I've realized there's a time and a place. There's a time and a place. I'm tailgating at 8 in the morning, going to a Bills game. Yeah, I'm going to drink some Labatt's, and I'm totally fine with that. I'm fine with drinking Budweiser, but I know what it is, right? And in fact, the one thing I give them credit for is the consistency. Like Ron and I, we talked about it, I think, off the air. Ron and I have made beer in our own personal life. To replicate the exact same flavor over and over again is not easy.
Scale.
It is hard. Not easy. And I've had Budweisers all over the world, and they always taste the same. So I'll give credit where credit is due, but I think it's wrong to in my opinion, you are intentionally misleading consumers. And I think there's something unethical about that.
Yeah, that's a fair criticism. A lack of transparency is basically part of the business model for at this point in the beer industry. It's gotten, consumers are very promiscuous at this point is a term that's thrown around in the industry. With you used to drink. They talk about occasions in beer, and for like 10 occasions you would drink 1 or 2 beers. Mm-hmm. So you were like a Bud man or a Coors guy or whatever it was. And that was the beer you drank, almost every time you opened a beer. Now, for 10 occasions, you're going to drink 8, 9, 10 different beers. And the way they're trying, or some hard seltzers. And the way they're trying to keep up with that is to sort of blur the lines on what is what. And again, I think there's something to be said for transparency with the consumer, but at the end of the day, they're about pleasing shareholders.
So Josh, I know we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you about a trend that's been happening over the last couple of years. I mean, you talked about there's 10,000 breweries nationwide, and it seems like every small town in America's got a brewery. And to be honest with you, a lot of these small towns that I've been to, the beer's not that good, but hey, at least they have a brewery, right? At least they have one. But I've also noticed that there's been a huge amount of consolidation going on, right? Like Sam Adams a couple years ago bought Dogfish Head, Victory and Southern Tier kind of had this merger. What do you think is going on right now? I mean, is this just their way of trying to compete with the Budweisers and the Core Miller? I mean, what do you think? What's your take of that consolidation?
Well, I mean, it's consolidation, but it's not. I mean, if it was true consolidation, the number of breweries would be getting smaller, right? But the number keeps getting larger. So the new openings are definitely outpacing the mergers and the acquisitions and things like that. So I think that's sort of important context. But you also ask a relevant question. what's happened is that consumer tastes have fragmented. Like I said, the thing about the occasions, people are drinking different stuff for different times. Anheuser-Busch just is trying to, is just in Molson Coors have just been trying to keep up, with sort of the way consumer tastes have fragmented. There's smaller stories to explain it. I mean, the truth is Boston Beer, which is Sam Adams, they've been very successful on a number of fronts. They're truly hard seltzer. That was a game changer for those guys. Their Twisted Tea, that's a quiet giant for those guys. That their Angry Orchard cider, that was very meaningful for them. But what didn't keep up really was their beer business. Sam Adams is kind of a relic at this point. And they've never sort of been able to convincingly get in on the IPA trend, which is still
true. I couldn't even name a Sam Adams.
And
IPA.
what does Dogfish Head do well?
I couldn't even name a Sam Adams IPA, so that's a really good point you bring up.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And Dogfish Head, they've got 60-minute IPA. They've got 90-minute IPA. It's like they've got 120-minute IPA. Dogfish Head sort of did well the thing that Boston Beer needed. So that's just an example of sort of the smaller story and what's going on there. Now we're seeing sort of this interesting next generation where you've got Monster energy drinks buying Oscar Blues and that portfolio of beers, which includes Cigar City in Florida, which is they're well regarded. And some other breweries, you've got Sweetwater, who you're drinking. Did you know that they were sold?
I had heard, but I wasn't sure.
Huh?
So they got bought by like some cannabis company in Canada.
They're owned by a cannabis company now.
I guess that's kind of cool, right?
Cannabis company cooler than Anheuser-Busch. I think you can make that argument. Yeah.
A little bit of this, a little bit of that. But I know that definitely gets into some weird territory. Because, like, I know that it was weird. I remember seeing, like, some infomercials where Sam Adams or the Boston Brewing Company were basically trying to say, hey, guys, we're independent. We're a small brew company. And I think it's so weird that they had to even fight that. Like, it's almost like there was a lot of people who were turned off with, no, Sam Adams, they're not even a small company. They're huge. And it's such a weird phenomenon to even kind of go into where, like, Dogfish Head for so long, like, Sam Calgione, Alex and I met him a few times. Really nice guy. And it was such a weird thing with Dogfish Head because for so long they had fought to say, we are independent, we are not owned by anybody, we're going to do things our way because that's the way we want to do it. But it's tough because I don't think that, like, I wouldn't say that selling out to the Boston Brewing Company is selling out, but you could argue it in some ways. And I think for a lot of people, they looked at Sam Adams and said, you're not craft brewing. You're brewing on a scale, but you're brewing on a much bigger scale, like akin to, Coors, Miller, or Bud, right? It's tough.
Well, there's still a lot smaller than that. I mean, they're way smaller than Bud. I mean, even really, Miller's a lot smaller,
right?
But in the big scheme of things, I mean, it's in the eye of the beholder. But I would argue a sale, like all sales, are not the same. I think selling to New Belgium sold to one Japanese beer company, and Stone sold to the other Japanese beer company, and selling to a Japanese beer company is very different from selling to Anheuser-Busch, which has spent decades trying to tilt the competitive landscape in its favor and succeeded. I mean, you can just Google that and see all sorts of stories to show that. So, is there something sort of pure about, or Lagunitas, owned by
Right.
Heineken now. Something very pure about not having sold, but and this sort of gets to sort of the second half of the answer to your question, I think, Alex, at the start of this, which is what's happening is that these people who started breweries back in the 80s and 90s are getting
Cashing
older,
out.
and they need to know what's next. Yeah, I mean, I would almost say that's a cynical way of looking at it. But like Bell's in Michigan. Larry Bell was in his, I want to say, later 60s. He'd had 2 bouts of cancer. He tried to pass the brewery on to his kids. They just turned out not to be very interested. And so he sold the company, and now it's sort of operated by New Belgium, which is owned by an Australian beer company, which is owned by a Japanese beer company. But, what else was Larry Bell going to do? I mean, I guess what he could have become employee owned. I don't know about the nuances of that, or whether that was practical, or whether it made sense for anyone. But the point is he wanted to protect this thing he built. He wanted to ensure that it continued to exist, and he was ready to move on. So he needed to find an exit strategy.
And that's fair. And kind of in a similar vein, Ron and I lived for some time in the Philadelphia area. So I'm very curious what will ultimately become of Yuengling. Dick Yuengling is a 6th generation direct descendant of the origin. And of course, when he inherited it, Yuengling was a blue-collar, kind of considered only unless you're a coal miner in rural Pennsylvania are you going to drink this. And now, I mean, Yuengling is a juggernaut on the eastern part of the United States.
Yeah.
What becomes of Yuengling? I'll be very curious about.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a next generation lined up or not. I mean, if there is, and it is competent, and if it is willing, then they're good for another 30, 40 years in theory, right? If not, then they've got some stuff.
Yeah.
to
Well, it's
figure
weird
out.
too in the specific case of Yuengling. I want to say that there's like specific laws. I don't know exactly how enforceable they are, but it's like the next generation has to buy out the
It's
previous
not-
generation and the value of what it is, or something of
Yeah,
that nature.
no, that's not, Ron. So I know exactly what you're talking about. That is not
Yeah.
law, but it is. There has been 6 generations of Yuengling. Since Yuengling goes back to 1829, and
Right.
I think it stayed with men this whole time. Every man has bought it from their father at the value of the business, which of
Right.
course was easy when the business was only in a very remote part of Pennsylvania.
Right.
I can't imagine it would be economical for the next person. I think Dick Yuengling only has daughters. If one of
I
his
think he's
daughters
got
wanted
2
to,
daughters.
yeah,
And
if
I
one
think
of
they're both in competition for trying to, in some way, take on or continue it. But the's definitely,
There's
I
no
think
way they
Dick
could
Yuengling
buy
is
it.
about to retire.
There's
Yeah.
no way they could buy it at the actual value price of Yuengling. And Yuengling is a massive company now, but
Right.
it'll be interesting to see how things play out.
Yeah.
So, Josh, wrapping up, last 2 questions. Number one is a short one. I think people listening here might be going, hey, you're making me thirsty. I want to be drinking some beer. I want to go check out a cool beer town. Maybe I have a vacation lined up. I think a lot of people, when they think about beer cities, it's like, oh, you got Denver, you got San Diego, maybe you got San Jose. In your opinion, and I know your expertise is Chicago, but what is an underrated beer town?
I think that I'm going to cop out here, and so let me preface by saying I spent a lot of years sort of wading into the question you just asked and exploring it firsthand. And since the pandemic, which is 2.5 years, I've basically stopped doing that. I'm sure there are some really good answers. Like it could be Tallahassee, for all I know. I don't know. But the thing that really strikes me is, again, something we sort of nodded to before, which is how much good beer there is everywhere. Like if you go to Phoenix, you're going to find great beer. If you go to Tallahassee, there is going to be great beer. If you go to Charlotte, I can't name you a single brewery in Charlotte, North Carolina. I promise you there are at least 2 or 3 really good breweries in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's just the thing that blows me away about the state of the American beer industry is how much good beer there is in all directions. But again, I also want to put the asterisks on there and say like the craft beer industry is not
there are not
flawless by any stretch.
10,000 great
There's also
breweries. There are not.
There are not. There are absolutely not. But they turn up in all sorts of places, and you never know where. And that's one of the things that I find really sort of neat and rewarding about what's become of the American beer industry.
Fair enough. Final question of the night, Josh. You already talked about your book, which we are going to post on, but can you quickly, how did that come to be and where can we find it? Is it on Amazon?
It is on Amazon. It's on Amazon. It's, gosh, I don't even know. I mean, it's in Chicago, at least. It's in probably a decent number of indie bookstores also. And you can walk into, if you don't want to give Amazon the business, I tip my cap to you, and you can go to your local indie bookstore, ask them to order it, and they can. Any bookstore can get it. It's there to be had. But if you want to get it on Amazon too, I wouldn't begrudge you. How did it come to be? So the Goose Island sold to Anheuser-Busch in 2011, like I said, and it was pretty clearly a pivotal thing to happen to the beer industry. Anheuser-Busch, the maker of Bud and Bud Light, buying one of the great craft breweries. I mean, now it's kind of like, well, of course they did, craft beer is so mainstream now. But when that happened in 2011, it was really radical and pretty brilliant foresight by
Josh,
Anheuser-Busch,
real quick,
honestly.
because I wasn't living in Chicago at the time. I mean, when this happened, and maybe you talk about it in the book, I mean, were people in Chicago, were people outraged? I mean, were people upset?
I got a whole chapter just about the reaction. Yeah, you read it. Yes, people were furious. And that's one of the fascinating things about craft beer also, is that people have this really personal relationship with it. Like we don't have that personal relationship with our refrigerators and dishwashers and, I was going to say our shoes, but that's not necessarily true. We can have a pretty intimate relationship with our clothing brands. I don't give a crap. But beer is just this, you're like our yogurt. Like you don't really give a shit about what yogurt you buy in the store. You just want a brand that kind of looks nice and tastes good. But craft beer, like created this really intimate bond with the consumer. And that was something that big beer could not compete with. And that's why big beer had to get in on it. And that's why Anheuser-Busch had to buy Goose Island. And Goose Island wound up being the first of 18-ish craft breweries that Anheuser-Busch went on to buy. And then Miller bought some. Heineken, like we talked about, bought Lagunitas. And, and then sort of this consolidation / mergers and acquisitions era of craft beer really took root, starting with the Goose Island sale. So that sale happened, and it was pretty clear that something monumental had happened, but, exactly what it wasn't entirely clear. So I sort of set out to answer that question. Like, what was Anheuser-Busch trying to do by, being the stodgy old great American beer company, buying this like scrappy, brilliant little, Chicago craft brewery that sort of defined in a lot of ways what craft beer was. It was just such an odd pairing at the time. Again, now in retrospect, with the passage of time, it's been more than 11 years. We get it now, but in the book, I'm sort of explaining that answer. And the book came. I started working on it pretty soon after the sale in 2011. The book came out in 2018. So, I had the benefit of Anheuser-Busch buying a bunch more breweries while I was reporting the book, and a bunch of other breweries selling too. Ballast Point for $1 billion to Constellation Brands, which is Corona, Modelo, those Mexican beers. Lagunitas selling for $1 billion to Heineken. After the founder of Lagunitas decried the idea of selling out very publicly, and then guess what he turned around and did? He took the money and ran. So I was just sort of exploring this phenomenon in craft beer and how we got there and what it meant. And it was a fun and fascinating story to tell. It's really, beer's fun to drink, it's a really wonderful social lubricant, right? It's a great thing to do after work and drink on a podcast and all that, but it's also a really fascinating industry. And the businesses and the stories inside of that industry are just endlessly fascinating. And it was really rewarding to tell that in book.
Amazing. Well, listen, again, for those listening, check out Barrel Aged Stout and Selling Out, Goose Island, Anheuser-Busch, and how craft beer became big business. We will be posting that and make it available on our podcast. And Josh, this has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for being on the show. And certainly, if you ever write another book, I hope you'll return.
I am writing another book. I haven't talked publicly about what it's about yet, but I'm pretty fired up about it. I think you guys will be interested in it, and yes, maybe we will discuss it one day down the line. But it's coming together, slow but sure. Hopefully in what year are we now? Hopefully in 2023, that sucker will be
awesome.
Saying hello to the world.
Love it. Well, we'll have you on then, and for that, this has been another episode of Between Two Studs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.